The sun had barely risen over the quiet fields as a gentle breeze swept through the stables, carrying with it the earthy scent of fresh hay and the promise of a new day. The horses, calm and collected, stood ready for the morning exercise. Among them was a seasoned jumper, known for his agility and speed. But today, something was different. His ears flicked back in irritation, his body stiffened, and when his rider asked him to jump, he refused. At first, it seemed like just a momentary lapse of refusal that could easily be corrected with a little coaxing. But as time went on, the horse continued to resist, pulling back each time the jump was attempted. The rider, frustrated and perplexed, couldn't understand why this once reluctant jumper had suddenly developed such a strong aversion to the simplest of tasks. Had something gone wrong? Was it just a temporary moment of stubbornness, or was there something more at play? The days passed, and the horse's reluctance only grew. Trainers, experienced riders, and even the stable hands all took turns attempting to coax the animal over the jump, but nothing worked. With each failed attempt, the tension in the barn grew thicker, as whispers spread about the possible causes of the horse's behavior. Was he sick? Injured? Or was he simply trying to send a message? The riders couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. They had all seen this horse jump countless times before, each time with perfect form and confidence. Now, though, the bond between the horse and the rider seemed to be fraying. The horse was becoming increasingly agitated, almost as if he was terrified of the jump. The frustration in the stables reached a boiling point. It was almost as if everyone had missed something, a sign or a warning that no one had noticed. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the horizon and the stable had settled into its familiar quiet, a new possibility began to surface. Could it be that the horse was trying to communicate something far deeper than anyone realized? Perhaps the key wasn't about training or technique, but something far more personal. A hidden fear? A past experience that had left its mark on him? The questions kept mounting, and with every unanswered attempt, the mystery deepened. And then, just when it seemed like everyone had exhausted all possibilities, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the stable hands, someone who had spent years quietly observing the horses, noticed something that no one else had, a subtle shift in the horse's behavior when approached in a specific way. This wasn't just about physical reluctance, it was about something emotional, something psychological. The horse had been trying to tell them something all along, but no one had been listening. But what exactly was the horse trying to say? What had happened in his past that had led to this moment? The answers were waiting just beyond the surface, hidden beneath layers of fear and doubt. And as the stable fell silent once more, everyone knew that they were about to uncover something far more profound than anyone could have imagined. The real reason behind the horse's refusal was only just beginning to reveal itself, and it was a story that would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the connection between horse and rider. The next chapter of this mysterious tale was about to unfold. As the days passed, the tension around the barn only grew stronger. The horse's behavior had become the talk of the stable, and despite the best efforts of everyone involved, no one could get to the bottom of the mystery. The once jumpy horse, known for his perfect leaps and unyielding drive, had transformed into a creature of stubborn refusal. Every time his rider asked him to jump, he seemed to flinch, his body locking up as though something was holding him back. His refusal was no longer a simple act of defiance, it felt like a deep, visceral fear. Something had changed inside him, and no one could figure out why. The riders began to notice little things, subtle details they'd overlooked before. The horse's eyes, once full of life, now seemed clouded with uncertainty. His ears flicked back every time someone approached with the intention to train him. It was as if he no longer trusted the familiar, the things that once brought him joy. His refusals were not only in the ring, they spread to his everyday routine. He hesitated before moving to his stall, as though every step was weighed down with a burden he couldn't escape. Even his interactions with the stable hands, who had always been a source of comfort, became distant. It was clear that something had happened to him, something that had shaken him to his core. But what was it? The first person to truly try and get close to the horse was a trainer who had known him since his earliest days. She was patient, calm, and understood the intricacies of animal behavior better than anyone. She could read every shift in his body, every flicker of his eyes, but even she couldn't explain the sudden change. She tried everything she could think of working with him in a quiet, calm environment, slowly building back trust. She even spent hours with him outside the ring, brushing him, walking him around the stables, just letting him remember what it was like to feel safe. But every time they returned to the jump, his fear returned. It was as though there was an invisible barrier between them, something he couldn't overcome. One evening, after yet another failed attempt, the trainer stood by the fence, watching the horse quietly graze in the field. She had been coming to the stables every day, trying to uncover the mystery, but the answers had remained elusive. She was beginning to feel like she was chasing shadows, running in circles, unable to find the root of the problem. It was in this moment of frustration that the stable hand, the quiet one who had always been in the background, approached her. "I think I know what's going on," he said, his voice low but steady. The trainer turned, surprised. The stable hand wasn't one to speak much. He usually kept to himself, preferring to let his actions speak louder than words. But now, he looked serious, almost as if he had a secret he was about to reveal. The stable hand explained that he had noticed something the others hadn't, something that seemed to have slipped past everyone's notice in the rush to fix the horse's behavior. "I've seen him around this place long enough to know when something's wrong, and it's not just the jump," he said. "There's something deeper happening with him, something from before he came here." The trainer was skeptical at first. What did he mean by that? The horse had always been a reliable jumper, the kind of animal you could count on. But the stable hand was insistent. He explained how, a few weeks ago, the horse had started showing signs of unease, of something that wasn't visible on the surface. It wasn't just the jumps, it was the way he reacted when approached by certain people, the way his body tensed when anyone came near him too quickly. After a few moments of contemplation, the trainer asked the obvious question. "Do you think something happened to him before he came here? Maybe an injury or some kind of traumatic event?" The stable hand nodded slowly. "I don't know what it is yet, but I've been trying to piece it together. There's a history with this horse that no one's talked about." His words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking into the trainer's chest. She knew that the past often had a way of resurfacing when least expected, and the thought that something from the horse's past could be influencing his behavior now was both troubling and intriguing. What had happened to him? What was it that was keeping him from jumping? The trainer knew that to find the answers, she needed to dig deeper. She spent the next few days speaking to the previous owners of the horse, trying to gather any information about his background. Most of what she uncovered was mundane routine training, standard care, but there were whispers, vague mentions of things that hadn't seemed significant at the time. The horse had come from a different stable, one that had recently closed down. The circumstances of his departure were unclear, but there was talk of a traumatic incident that involved the horse being spooked by something in the past. What exactly had happened remained a mystery, but one thing was clear: the horse had been through something that had shaken him to his core. As the trainer continued to search for clues, the stable hand became more and more insistent. He began pulling her aside, showing her details about the horse's behavior that pointed to something more than just a fear of jumping. He started to wonder if the horse wasn't just afraid of the jump itself, but of the very act of being asked to perform. It was as if every time the horse approached the jump, memories of something dark and hidden would flood his mind, pushing him into a state of panic. The refusal wasn't defiance, it was fear. And it wasn't just any fear, it was the kind of fear that came from something deeply ingrained in his psyche. But what could have caused such a reaction? Could it be that the horse had experienced something traumatic, something that had scarred him in a way that no one had recognized? The more the trainer and stable hand talked, the more they began to feel like they were standing on the edge of a much bigger mystery. Something was wrong, but they still couldn't put their finger on it. The answers felt just out of reach, like a puzzle with a piece missing. With each passing day, the horse's behavior grew more perplexing. It became clear that this wasn't just a case of a horse refusing a jump. Something far more complex was at play. And the more the trainer and stable hand dug, the more they uncovered about the horse's history. The more they realized they were unraveling a mystery that no one could have predicted. What had really happened to this horse? What was he trying to communicate? And why was he so terrified? The answers were out there, but they were buried deep beneath layers of fear, history, and pain. And every time someone tried to uncover the truth, it seemed like the horse pulled further away, closing himself off to anyone who came too close. The mystery was growing and the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. The horse's refusal wasn't just about jumping anymore. It was about something far more personal, something no one could fully understand until they uncovered the truth. And that truth was a long time coming. The following days were filled with tension and uncertainty. The horse's refusal to jump had become the center of every conversation in the stables, and despite everyone's best efforts, the mystery deepened. The trainer's concern grew with each passing moment. Every time she walked into the barn, the sense of unease was palpable, hanging heavy in the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, something more than just a horse's refusal to perform. It wasn't just the horse's actions, it was the strange energy in the barn. The once thriving atmosphere, filled with the rhythmic sound of hooves and the hum of daily routines, now felt tense and heavy, as though everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid of triggering something they didn't fully understand. The stable hand's cryptic words echoed in her mind, and she found herself replaying every detail he had shared with her. There was something buried in the horse's past that no one had been able to uncover, something that had caused this change in his behavior. She had tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on the task at hand, but every time she looked at the horse, she couldn't help but wonder what he was trying to tell her. Was it something from his time at the previous stable? Had he experienced something traumatic that left him scared and broken in ways no one could see? The more she thought about it, the more questions piled up, each one more pressing than the last. One evening, after a particularly frustrating session where the horse refused the jump yet again, the trainer sat in the corner of the stable, her head buried in her hands. She was exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally. It had been days of trying and failing to break through to the horse, and every time she thought they were making progress, it seemed like they were back at square one. She needed answers. The horse needed answers. But no one had them. It felt like she was trapped in a loop, spinning in circles, never getting closer to understanding the real reason behind the horse's behavior. As she sat there in the quiet, the stable hand approached her again, his face more serious than ever. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "maybe it's not just the horse we need to look at. Maybe it's the whole environment here. Maybe the things we've overlooked, the things we've taken for granted, are playing a part in all of this." The trainer frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Maybe this place, this stable, has something to do with it. We've all been focused on the horse and his past, but what if the real issue is the energy here?" His voice trailed off as if he were hesitant to say more, but the trainer could see that there was more on his mind. He wasn't just talking about the horse anymore, he was hinting at something larger, something she hadn't considered. For a moment, the trainer was silent, contemplating his words. Could the environment, the space they worked in every day, have an effect on the horse's behavior? She'd always thought of the stable as a safe, familiar place for the animals, a haven where they could recover, train, and grow. But what if something about the atmosphere, the way the barn was structured, the way it had been run in the past, was causing the horse to react this way? Was it possible that the trauma he had experienced wasn't just tied to his previous owner, but to the very place he was now? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She had spent so much time trying to uncover the horse's past that she hadn't even considered the possibility that something about the present might be contributing to his refusal to jump. What if there were old wounds, physical or emotional, that had been left behind in the very walls of the barn? What if those scars were still lingering, shaping the behavior of the animals that came through? The trainer found herself becoming consumed by these thoughts. It was hard to let them go. The more she pondered, the more she realized that she couldn't ignore the possibility that there were forces at work that were completely out of her control. Could the history of the barn hold secrets that no one had uncovered? Could the very structure of the place, its energy, its environment, be influencing the animals in ways they couldn't understand? As these thoughts swirled in her mind, she decided to take a step back and look at things from a different perspective. She couldn't ignore the possibility that the answer wasn't just about the horse, it was about the entire situation. She needed to dig deeper into the history of the barn, to uncover whatever hidden truths lay buried beneath the surface. She began speaking to the other stable hands, trying to learn more about the place's past. The more they talked, the more she began to uncover strange little details, snippets of information that didn't quite fit. The barn had always been a place of refuge for troubled horses, but there were rumors, whispers among the workers that not all the horses who had come through had been as lucky. Some had come and gone, with no clear explanation for their sudden disappearances. Others had been brought in with their own histories of trauma, stories that never seemed to make it to the outside world. The trainer couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the barn's reputation than anyone had let on. What if the space itself was somehow connected to the horse's fear? What if there were unresolved issues that were causing the animals to react in ways that seemed illogical, even irrational? She had no concrete evidence, only a sense that there was something hiding in plain sight, something everyone had missed. As the days went on, the horse's behavior became even more unpredictable. His refusals to jump turned into strange behaviors, unexplained pacing, nervous pawing, and even moments when he would freeze, as if caught in a trance. It was clear that the issue was deepening, becoming more than just a fear of the jump. It was as if the horse was trapped in his own mind, unable to escape the invisible hold that gripped him. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the stable grew quiet, the trainer noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The horse, standing in his stall, was staring intently at the far corner of the barn. His eyes were wide, fixed, and unblinking, as if he was seeing something no one else could. The trainer's heart raced as she slowly walked toward him, her footsteps barely making a sound on the barn floor. As she approached, she followed the direction of his gaze, trying to make sense of what he was focused on. There was nothing there. Nothing but shadows in the corner of the barn. But as she stood there, she could feel a coldness in the air, a strange energy that she hadn't noticed before. It was as though something invisible was lingering, something unsettling. The horse was reacting to it, his body tense and alert, as if he knew something was there that she couldn't see. The trainer stepped back, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this some kind of signal from the horse, a clue she hadn't picked up on? Or was the barn itself holding a secret that no one had been able to uncover? As she turned to leave the stall, her eyes caught a glimpse of something strange on the barn wall, something she hadn't noticed before. It was a mark, faded and barely visible, but it was there, etched into the wood. The trainer's heart skipped a beat as she realized that this could be the key she had been searching for. But what did it mean? And what did it have to do with the horse's refusal to jump? The mystery deepened, and the tension in the barn grew ever stronger. Every day brought more questions, more clues that seemed to lead nowhere. The horse's fear, the strange behavior, the unexplained marks in the barn, everything was connected, but no one could see the full picture yet. The real reason for the horse's refusal to jump was still hidden, buried deep within the shadows of the barn's past. And until the trainer could uncover the truth, there would be no answers, only more questions. The tension would continue to build, and the mystery would grow, until the day when everything finally came to light. But that day had not yet come. The trainer couldn't stop thinking about the strange mark on the barn wall. It had appeared so suddenly, as if from nowhere. It had been so faint at first, just a small, jagged line etched into the wood, but now, with every passing moment, it seemed to grow clearer in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was a sign, something left behind that could unlock the entire mystery. But what was it? What could such a small detail mean in the grand scheme of things? Every time she walked into the barn, it was all she could focus on. Her eyes kept drifting toward that corner, toward that mark. She knew she had to dig deeper, but every time she tried, she felt as though the answers were slipping further and further away. The horse's behavior had grown more erratic. The refusal to jump had escalated into bizarre, almost unexplainable actions. One moment, he was calm and collected, the next, he was trembling, pacing nervously, or staring blankly into space as though lost in a place no one could follow. It was like something inside him was breaking, something that had been buried for a long time was finally coming to the surface. And no one could make sense of it. The trainer spoke to the stable hand again, urging him to help her search for answers. Together, they tried to investigate the barn's past, speaking with anyone who might have information about its history. But the more they dug, the more they realized just how little they truly knew. The barn had been around for decades, yet so much of its history seemed locked away, buried in layers of time and secrecy. There were rumors of old owners who had vanished, of horses that had come and gone without explanation. The stories were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table, with no one able to put them all together. One night, as the trainer stood alone in the barn, something strange happened. The wind outside picked up, and the old barn creaked under the pressure. The horses in their stalls shifted uneasily, their ears twitching, their movements quickening. It was as if they sensed something, a change in the air. Then it came. A noise from the farthest corner of the barn, where the mark had appeared. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft sound, almost like the whisper of footsteps. But as the moments passed, it grew louder, more distinct. The sound of something or someone moving in the shadows. The trainer's heart raced. Her instincts told her to run, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. She stepped slowly toward the corner, her breath catching in her throat. The barn was eerily quiet except for the sound of her own footsteps, the creaking of the wood beneath her, and the unsettling rustling that seemed to come from the darkened corner. As she approached, the noise stopped. Silence. The trainer held her breath, eyes scanning the area. But the darkness of the corner seemed to swallow everything, as though it were hiding something she couldn't see, couldn't understand. She took one more step forward, and in that moment, the barn seemed to breathe with her. A cold draft swept through, and the horses stirred in their stalls, their movements jerky and anxious. The tension in the air was thick, oppressive. Then, suddenly, a soft whinny broke through the silence, sharp and clear, as if from nowhere. The trainer froze, her heart pounding. She knew that sound. It was the horse. The one who had refused to jump. The one she had been trying to understand. But where was he? The barn was empty, save for the other horses in their stalls. There was no sign of him, yet the sound seemed to come from right in front of her. A strange feeling washed over her. A feeling that something was terribly wrong, that she had stumbled into something much larger than she had anticipated. She stepped back slowly, eyes darting across the dimly lit barn, searching for the source of the sound. The whisper of movement returned, this time behind her. She spun around, her heart in her throat. But there was nothing. Only the dim light flickering from the overhead lamp and the distant shadows cast by the barn's worn walls. Then, something caught her eye. A shadow. Darker than the rest. It moved, just a flicker, but it was enough to make her stop in her tracks. She took a step forward, her pulse racing. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the wooden wall, and there it was again, the mark. But this time, it was different. It had changed slightly, as if someone had scraped it deeper into the wood. The jagged line now formed an almost recognizable shape, an arc, like the image of a jump. The trainer stepped back, her mind spinning. Could this be the key? Was the mark connected to the horse's refusal? Could it be a message, a warning, or something far more sinister? She wasn't sure, but she knew that she couldn't leave until she uncovered the truth. She had to understand what the horse was trying to tell her. Her eyes darted to the horse's stall. There he was, standing perfectly still, his eyes locked on her, as though he had been waiting for this moment. There was something in his gaze, something deep and knowing, like he had seen everything unfold before him. The trainer's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she felt a chill not just from the environment, but from the horse himself. And then it hit her. She had been looking at the wrong clues. The mark on the wall. The strange noises. The horse's refusal. It wasn't just about the jump. It wasn't even about the barn's history. It was about something deeper, something tied to the very heart of what had been lost here. In that moment, she understood. She couldn't explain it, not yet, but she felt it deep within her. The horse was trying to show her something. He had been through something that had scarred him. Something horrific, something tied to the very barn they were standing in. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. As she stood there, her heart racing, the barn seemed to close in around her. The walls felt like they were pressing in, suffocating, and the shadows stretched longer, darker. She looked once more at the horse, who stood with his gaze unwavering, and she knew that whatever was coming next, it was going to be something that would change everything. The horse's refusal wasn't just about the jump. It was about survival. And there was something in the barn that hadn't been dealt with, something that was about to resurface. The tension hung thick in the air. The calm before the storm. And as the trainer prepared to uncover the last, most dangerous part of the mystery, she knew she had to be ready for whatever came next. The air in the barn had grown even colder, a strange, unnatural chill that crept into her bones. The trainer couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond her sight, something close, something she had yet to fully understand. She had spent days, weeks chasing down every lead, every possible explanation, but now, standing in the dimly lit barn, the pieces of the puzzle were shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated. The horse's gaze was unwavering, but it wasn't just his eyes that seemed to pierce through her. It was his stillness, a quiet, almost unsettling calm that told her he knew something she didn't. Her fingers brushed against the wall where the mark had deepened, and for the first time, she noticed something new, a faint, almost imperceptible scent, like earth and something else, something sharp, almost metallic. It made her stomach turn. She had smelled this scent before, but it had never felt so close, so real. It was familiar, yet utterly unsettling, as though it was linked to a place, or a moment in time, that she could not grasp. The barn had always been a sanctuary for animals, a place where they could recover, heal, and train. But as she stood there, it felt more like a cage, as if the walls were holding her in, keeping her from escaping the truth. She took a step back, her mind racing, and that's when she heard a faint rustling behind her, just beyond the stall door. At first, it seemed like the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too structured. There was no breeze to carry it. She turned quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Only the dim light casting long, eerie shadows across the barn floor. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She didn't know whether to approach or run. A part of her wanted to leave, to escape the growing tension, but the other part, the part that had driven her this far, felt an undeniable pull to stay. She had to know what was really happening. As she stood frozen in place, the horse suddenly shifted in his stall, his hooves striking the floor with a loud, sharp crack. The sound echoed through the barn like a warning. Her eyes shot back to him, and for a brief moment, his head turned, as if he were pointing toward the farthest corner of the barn. The very same corner where the mark had first appeared. Something wasn't right. She could feel it deep in her gut. She moved cautiously toward the stall, her footsteps soft but quick, the tension in the air tightening with every step. The sound from earlier, a rustling, returned, louder now, almost like it was coming from beneath the floorboards. She dropped to her knees and pressed her ear to the ground, straining to listen. The faint noise was there again, but it wasn't just a rustle. It was a scratching, like claws scraping against wood. Her blood ran cold. The sound wasn't coming from beneath the floor, it was coming from inside the walls. She pulled herself up, heart racing, and scanned the room. The barn, which had once felt familiar and safe, now seemed like a place full of secrets, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. She turned to the stable hand, who had been watching from the doorway, his face pale. He didn't need to say anything. The expression on his face told her everything she needed to know. He had heard it too. Without saying a word, they both moved toward the back of the barn, where the sound seemed to be growing louder. The rustling and scratching intensified, building in a way that felt almost frantic. The trainer's hand shook as she reached for the door to the farthest stall. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the darkness seemed thicker, denser, like it was waiting to swallow them whole. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. A pile of old hay, broken crates, and shattered tools scattered across the floor. But amidst the mess, there was something else, something far worse. A door. An old, rotting wooden door, barely hanging on its hinges. She had never seen it before. There had never been any mention of a second door in the barn, nothing that suggested it could lead to something more. But here it was, hidden in plain sight, covered by the debris, as though it had been deliberately concealed. The stable hand's voice was barely above a whisper. We need to get out of here. This isn't right." The trainer didn't respond. She couldn't. All she could do was stare at the door, her heart racing in her chest. She had found it. The answer she had been searching for was just beyond that door. But what lay behind it? The air around them seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, the barn groaning like it was alive, like it was breathing, like it was trying to tell her something. The horse's whinny broke through the silence once again, but this time, it wasn't the sound of a frightened animal. No. It was different, louder, almost desperate, as if he was calling to her, urging her to listen. But listen to what? Without thinking, she took a step forward. The stable hand reached out to stop her, but she pushed past him. She wasn't sure why she was doing this, why she was walking straight toward the door, but it was as if something deep inside her, something primal, was pushing her forward. Her hand touched the cold, decaying wood of the door, and with a slow, creaking motion, she pulled it open. What lay beyond the threshold made her heart stop in her chest. The passage was narrow, hidden in the very walls of the barn, leading downward into darkness. She could feel the temperature drop even further, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and mold. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but her feet moved on their own, carrying her further down the passage. Behind her, the stable hand stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief, but the trainer couldn't stop now. She had to know. She had to see where this led. She had uncovered a second secret, a door no one had spoken of, a place no one had dared to enter. As she descended further into the passage, the scraping noise returned, louder now, echoing off the stone walls. And then, as if answering her every step, she heard something else, something that made her freeze in her tracks. A voice. Low. Whispers. Faint, but unmistakable. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was clear. It was a warning. Something or someone was down there, waiting. The tension reached a breaking point. She had found the hidden passage, but what she had uncovered was far more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. The stakes were higher now. The horse's refusal, the strange mark on the wall, the rumors of disappearances, it was all connected. But what exactly was waiting for her in the dark? The trainer didn't know, but there was no turning back now. The air grew thicker as the trainer descended deeper into the passage. The whispers, almost too faint to catch, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if they were coming from the very walls, a sound so ancient it carried an eerie sense of foreboding. Each step forward felt like stepping further into something unknown, something that had been waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no turning back. She had to know what lay ahead, what secrets the barn was hiding. The stable hand was still behind her, but his presence felt distant now, as if he were a spectator to a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His footsteps faltered as the darkness deepened. This isn't right," he muttered, his voice trembling. But the trainer didn't hear him anymore. She was already too far gone, driven by a need to understand what had been left buried in this forsaken place. The passage seemed to stretch on endlessly. The stone walls were damp to the touch, the chill crawling up her spine, but ahead, a faint light glowed, just a small sliver, like a beckoning, a promise. The whispers grew louder now, almost as if they were calling her forward, urging her to reach the end. And then she saw it. The walls opened into a small, hidden room, and in the center, beneath the dim light of a flickering torch, stood something she hadn't expected to find. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even an animal. It was something much worse. A structure, old and twisted, like a makeshift altar. Atop it lay a collection of strange objects, shiny rocks, worn coins, broken trinkets. And in the center of it all, a single object caught her eye. A small, rusted horseshoe. As the trainer stepped forward, the ground beneath her feet shifted, a faint creak echoing through the air. She froze. The stable hand, who had been following her every step, now stood at the edge of the room, looking horrified. "You don't understand," he whispered, shaking his head. This is where it all began." She turned to him, her voice low and firm. "What do you mean? What happened here?" He hesitated, eyes darting to the horseshoe on the altar. "There was a ritual," he began, his voice barely audible. "Long before this barn was built. People came here, strangers, travelers who worshipped something else. They believed they could control the animals, even the horses. But what they didn't know was that the creatures they were trying to control were not just beasts. They were connected to something darker. Something ancient." The trainer's stomach twisted as she absorbed the words, but before she could respond, the horse's whinny echoed from the farthest corner of the room. It was sharp, frantic, and more desperate than ever. She turned to find him standing there, his body rigid, his eyes wide with terror. For a moment, the trainer was paralyzed. It was as though the horse could see something she couldn't. Something that was coming, something dangerous. Suddenly, the walls of the small room seemed to contract, the air thickening as though the barn itself were alive, pressing in from all sides. The whispers escalated into an eerie, almost deafening chant. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as if responding to the ritual the stable hand had spoken of, a force awakening, stirred by the presence of the horseshoe. The barn's groaning was no longer just the sound of age. It felt deliberate, like a warning. Then, in a flash, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The trainer recalled the strange mark on the wall, the one that had deepened over time. It wasn't a simple scratch or a random pattern. It was a symbol, an ancient glyph, one associated with rituals of control, power, and binding. The same kind of symbol the stable hand had described, one used to summon forces beyond human understanding. But what had they summoned? And what did they plan to do with the horse? The moment the trainer made the connection, the room seemed to shift, warping and twisting, the air becoming dense and oppressive. The horse bucked in his stall, rearing up and striking the walls with his hooves, but it was more than just fear. It was as though he was trying to fight something inside him, something trying to take hold. Without warning, the stable hand collapsed to the floor with a loud crash, his body seizing in unnatural spasms. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. It was as though something was choking him from within. His fingers twitched and grasped at the ground as though he were trying to reach for something, but there was nothing. He was paralyzed. The trainer rushed to his side, panic rising in her chest, but before she could reach him, the light in the room flickered violently. The horseshoe on the altar began to vibrate, its rusted edges glowing with a faint, eerie light. The horse in the stall reared up again, his body convulsing, eyes wide with terror. The walls of the barn groaned, and the whispers grew louder, louder than ever, until they were all she could hear. Suddenly, everything went still. The stable hand's body went limp, his eyes lifeless, as if whatever had taken hold of him had finally claimed him. The barn seemed to breathe again, a slow, heavy exhale of air. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence deafening. And that's when she saw it, the final, chilling twist. The horse, standing still now, his eyes locked on hers, wasn't just afraid. He wasn't just refusing to jump anymore. He wasn't a victim of some strange, unexplainable fear. He was the key. The creature they had tried to control. The thing they had summoned all those years ago. And now, it had found its new master. The trainer's heart skipped a beat as the realization dawned on her. The horse had not been refusing to jump. He had been refusing to obey. He had been resisting the call of something dark, something ancient that had been awakened by the barn's twisted past. The ritual, the symbol, the whispers, they had all been part of the plan to bring the horse back into the fold. But something had gone wrong. Something had shifted. The stable hand had been a part of that plan. He had known what was at stake, but now he was lost, consumed by whatever had been summoned. And then the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The horse wasn't just a symbol of control. He was the key to breaking it. The barn, the ritual, the mark on the wall, it had all been leading to this moment. The trainer wasn't just trying to solve a mystery. She was the one who had been chosen to stop it. To stop whatever dark force had been awakened, threatening to consume everything in its path. But as she stood there, the barn trembling around her, she realized that the true battle was only just beginning. And she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to fight it. The horse's eyes met hers once again, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she saw something in them that made her blood run cold. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something far more sinister. And with that, everything went dark. The world around her dissolved into a shuddering blackness, the air heavy with the oppressive weight of something ancient, something that had lived long before the barn, before any of the townsfolk had even set foot in this place. The trainer's senses dulled as the barn's groaning grew louder, drowning out the sounds of her racing heartbeat. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Her body felt anchored in place, locked in a nightmare she hadn't known she was part of. The horse's gaze, cold and unblinking, was the last thing she saw before the world vanished completely. But then, as if waking from a dream, the darkness receded, and the barn reappeared around her, though something had changed. The flickering light from the torch cast long, twisting shadows across the walls, making the space feel alien, otherworldly. The air was thick, and the whispers, those soft, sibilant whispers, were back, closer now, as if they were just behind her, breathing down her neck. Her hands trembled as she reached for the torch on the altar, the only source of light in this suffocating silence. She spun around, desperate for answers, but found nothing. The stable hand was gone. His body, moments before lifeless, was now nowhere to be seen. In fact, everything about the barn seemed different now. The walls felt closer, the shadows darker, and the very air itself seemed to hum with a quiet energy. But it wasn't the kind of energy that made her feel alive. It was the kind of energy that made her feel small, insignificant, as if the world were shifting and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As her eyes scanned the room, she noticed the horseshoe on the altar again, its rusted metal glowing faintly in the dim light. The sound of hooves echoed from the stable, louder now, almost as if the horse was trying to break free. She gripped the torch tighter, feeling its warmth seep into her palms, and moved toward the stall where the animal had been trapped. But as she approached, she stopped dead in her tracks. The stall door was wide open. Her breath caught in her throat. She had locked it earlier. She was sure of it. But now it was ajar, and the horse who had been so frantic, so desperate before was nowhere in sight. The stable was silent now, except for the occasional creak of the barn as if it were settling back into place after a great upheaval. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped inside the stall. The floor was covered in hay, and the faint scent of the animal still lingered, but there were no signs of struggle, no trace of the horse's panic. It was as if he had simply vanished. The whispers grew louder again, filling her mind with an urgency she couldn't ignore. She had to find him. The barn, no, the land itself felt alive now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The stable hand's words echoed in her mind, this is where it all began. She knew now. The ritual. The power that had been unleashed all those years ago wasn't gone. It hadn't been sealed. It had been waiting dormant, like a sleeping giant. The barn, the symbols, the horse, they were all part of it. The ritual had been incomplete. She had come here seeking answers, but what she'd discovered was far darker than anything she could have imagined. The horse had been the key. But he wasn't just an innocent animal caught in the middle. He was a vessel. A link between this world and something beyond it. And now, he was free. Her heart pounded as she stepped out of the stall and into the main area of the barn. She needed to act quickly. The horse was no longer the frightened creature who had refused to jump. He had changed, and so had everything around her. The very air seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a force that was growing stronger with each passing moment. And then she heard it. A low, guttural growl. It came from deep within the barn, deep within the earth itself. The ground beneath her feet trembled. It wasn't the barn settling. It wasn't the wind shifting. It was something else, something that made her blood run cold. She turned toward the sound, and there, in the far corner of the barn, the horse stood, his body silhouetted against the faint glow of the torchlight. But this wasn't the same horse. His eyes, once wide with fear, were now filled with something else, something dark, something that didn't belong in this world. His coat gleamed, but it wasn't the glossy brown she had once admired. It was darker now, like the depths of a forest at night. His body seemed to ripple with an unnatural energy, as though he were no longer bound by the laws of nature. The barn creaked again, louder this time, and then the whispers returned, voices too many to count, rising and falling like a chant. The horse turned his head toward her, his gaze locking with hers. She could feel the weight of his stare, as if he were trying to tell her something, something that was beyond her understanding. Her mind raced. The ritual, the markings, the door, the disappearance of the stable hand, they were all part of this. The horse had been the key, but now, he was the one holding the power. He had become the very thing the ritual had sought to control. She felt her legs weaken beneath her, but she refused to look away. she couldn't let herself show fear. Not now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. But the truth was more terrifying than she had imagined. The horse whinnied again, but this time, the sound wasn't the usual call of an animal. It was a command, a signal. And in that moment, she knew what had to be done. She had to stop him. She had to stop whatever this force was before it consumed everything in its path. The barn shook violently, and the walls seemed to ripple with energy. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling her head with thoughts she couldn't control. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she felt herself being pulled toward the altar, as if the very ground beneath her was trying to claim her. With everything she had left, she forced herself to move, her steps heavy and unsteady. She reached the altar and grabbed the horseshoe, feeling the cold metal against her palm. The whispers seemed to hush for a moment, and she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. But it was fleeting. She could feel the horse, could feel his power drawing closer. As she turned toward him, the air crackled with electricity. The barn seemed to glow with a strange, otherworldly light. The horse's eyes, filled with the power of something ancient, stared directly at her. And in that moment, she understood. The horse wasn't the enemy. He had never been the enemy. It was the ritual. The forces that had been unleashed. The power that had been summoned. She had been wrong. All this time, she had believed the horse was the one to be stopped. But it wasn't him. It was the darkness inside the ritual that needed to be sealed. The ground beneath her shook again, and she realized it was now or never. She had to end it, break the cycle, stop the darkness before it spread any further. With all her strength, she raised the horseshoe high above her head and slammed it down onto the altar. The force of it sent a shockwave through the barn, shaking the walls and breaking the chant of the whispers. The air around her crackled, the barn's pulse fading to silence. For a moment, everything was still. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The barn groaned, but this time, it was a sound of release, not of tension. The energy that had filled the air dissipated, leaving only silence in its wake. The horse stood still, his body no longer rippling with dark energy. His eyes, though still full of mystery, were no longer filled with the power that had controlled him. The barn returned to normal, its ancient walls no longer groaning in fear. The whispers were gone. The ritual was broken. And the horse, though still standing tall and proud, was no longer a vessel for something greater than him. The trainer stood there, breathless and exhausted, but she knew it wasn't over. The battle had been fought and won, but there were still remnants of the darkness that had nearly consumed everything. The barn had been saved. The horse had been freed. But the truth was, there was always more to discover, more mysteries waiting to be unraveled. And for now, that would be enough. The trainer looked one last time at the horse, her companion in this strange, dark journey. And as she walked out of the barn, the light of the setting sun flooded the doorway. She knew the truth now, and it was far bigger than anything she had ever imagined. The barn was no longer just a place of mystery. It was a place of power, of ancient forces that had been lying dormant, waiting for someone to unlock them. And now, she had the key. But the question remained, what would she do with it? As the door closed behind her, she felt a weight settle on her shoulders. She had uncovered the truth, but some truths were too dangerous to be left in the light. The story was over for now. But the whispers had never truly gone away.